Hey there, last time we talked about how Prager University got almost everything wrong in their video on the British Empire. Today I'd like to talk about a few things that they got right. The British Empire was extraordinarily influential. It helped to form almost everybody's ideas around freedom worldwide. Prager University and H.W. Crocker III, their British Empire guy, are absolutely right about that. But I don't think they really understand the concept of freedom and how it worked historically. That's what we'll be discussing today.
Freedom was an Englishman's right, and wherever he went, he took that right with him, whether he was an English colonist in America, governing himself through a locally elected assembly, or an English adventurer like Sir Stamford Raffles, creating the free market city-state of Singapore, or an English officer like T.E. Lawrence, leading Arab tribesmen against the Turks. The British always thought of themselves as liberators, as bringers of freedom.
The sorts of institutions that PragerU talks about in that video do bring a special something to societies all over the world. What free institutions bring is power. And freedom is not some magical fairy dust that white men with wigs hand out to people. Freedom must be taken. Freedom is often bloody and vicious. And the first thing that most peoples do when they achieve the power that free institutions give them is use that power to oppress somebody else. As a recent example, take a look at the newly democratic and enthusiastically genocidal Myanmar.
Freedom was an Englishman's right, and wherever he went, he took that right with him.
Freedom was an Englishman's right. And wherever he went, he took that right with him.
You see, that's exactly it. Freedom was an Englishman's right, not anybody else's. And because the English were, or at least saw themselves as freer than anybody else, they thought they were entitled to do whatever they wanted to whoever happened to be living on land that they wanted. You should already be aware of what those freedom-loving English colonists did to the Native Americans they mostly wiped out and the African slaves that they brutalized for over 2 centuries. Lawrence of Arabia is a romantic figure. In the 1962 movie, Obi-Wan Kenobi plays King Faisal, the wise Arab king the British made a lot of promises to in return for his helping them win World War I. After that war was won, it was English freedoms that mattered. The British stabbed this guy in the back, not just dividing up what he was promised with the French, but also helping the Saudis take control of the holy cities Faisal's family had controlled for centuries. Stamford Raffles is another interesting one. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British took over Dutch lands in Indonesia. In 1814, with an Anglo-Dutch treaty, they decided to give the land back, not to the indigenous peoples, but to the Dutch, because they wanted the Netherlands to be rich enough to act as a counterbalance to other European powers. But then Stamford Raffles took over Singapore, in territory that was supposed to be Dutch. So the British forced them to sign another treaty in 1824. It's particularly ironic that the Dutch were treated this way, because in the 1500s and 1600s, they had built a bloody empire with relatively free institutions for Dutch people. This was the model that the British quite explicitly copied. In the 1820s, the Dutch probably had institutions that were more like Britain's than anybody else in Europe. That didn't save them from English freedoms. Sorry if that was boring, but I think it nicely illustrates how much contempt the British had for other people's rights. Unfortunately, we expect historical figures to act in racist ways and run roughshod over the rights of people in other ethnic groups. But Britain didn't believe that the rights of other liberty-loving European countries were worth respecting either. That's how British freedom really worked. This may seem like a condemnation of the idea of freedom or free institutions, but it's really not. The modern world's institutions are so much better than what came before. But it was only British and Dutch wealth built through slavery, genocide, and other horrors that made those better institutions possible. That's really messed up, but also fascinating. Human beings are really messed up, but also fascinating. History is a terrible place, but it's a lot of fun to learn about. I always thought that an understanding that all of us human beings are fallen creatures was the bedrock of conservative thinking. Acknowledging that the darkness at the heart of human nature is inextricably linked to our potential is one of the fundamental insights of Christianity and the greatest Western political thought. I think that my internalizing of these concepts is part of what makes me a conservative. But this isn't PragerU's conservatism. For PragerU, being conservative seems to be about empty slogans, cheering on your team, and craving liberal tears. Freedom and free institutions are better, but they weren't some magical gift of the British. Free institutions and the idea of national independence were a series of bombs going off all over the world. Bombs that everybody else learned to control too, fairly quickly in historical terms. One reason British power fell away was because they lost their edge in this institutional arms race. I love freedom, but it's a dangerous thing. Paradoxically, the best way to confront this danger is with more freedom. More freedom for marginalized populations within powerful countries. More freedom for smaller countries to develop the institutions they need to survive. Freedom has to be balanced against itself. The height of the British Empire was an era almost completely without balance, when English freedoms rampaged over everybody. Prager and Prager think they're being super transgressive by pointing out that the British Empire was important, but that's only because they haven't done the relevant reading. Prager actually wrote a book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to the British Empire. I downloaded the free sample on my Kindle and browsed the table of contents. What's weird is that he seems to have missed, or at least minimized, one of the most important things about the British Empire. 100 years ago, most schoolchildren in the UK, and probably in the US too, could have told you about the Glorious Revolution. In 1688, the British Parliament bloodlessly fired the king, launching Britain on a path to greater liberties than anybody else and more power than anybody else. The Glorious Revolution inspired a philosopher named John Locke, who in turn inspired the founding fathers of the United States. British power was about geography and it was about industrialization, but it's likely that 1688 is what made Britain capable of maximizing these advantages the way it did. Prager doesn't seem to think 1688 is worth a chapter, and I guess that kind of makes sense. Prager is a 21st century historian, and talking about the Glorious Revolution has been out of fashion for quite some time now. So how are things going on the politically correct side of things? In 2012, two Harvard professors came out with a book called Why Nations Fail. The book is scrupulously politically correct, and it provides a careful, nerdy argument about the importance of institutions. And the crazy thing about it is that one of their conclusions is that the Glorious Revolution of 1688 is probably one of the most important things that has ever happened. They see it as an important starting point for better institutions. So the politically correct elitists are more knowledgeable about and more respectful of British institutions than the politically incorrect guys. Prager is right that British institutions have inspired people all over the world. As one example, almost every country in the world today has a parliament of some sort. But what Prager neglects to do is point out why that is. Sure, to some extent, it's because these ideals and institutions are naturally appealing. But it's mostly because the British used these institutions to build up an absurd amount of power. It's British power that convinced most of the world to adopt free government out of self-defense. So yeah, I guess you can thank the British Empire for your freedoms, but for me, it makes more sense to be thankful that all of us are now free from the tyranny of British freedoms. Well, that was a lot of talking. Come back next time when we travel to 19th century Egypt and put some historical weight behind these arguments. Egypt's tragedy shows both the power and attractiveness of freer, more modern institutions, and the way that British freedoms often crush those institutions. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And if you want to learn a ton more about these subjects, you can pick up my book, Avoiding the British Empire, available now on the Amazon Kindle and in paperback form. Thanks.